Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for People for Bikes virtual education series. We're so happy to have you here today. We are going to talk about 2024 policy wins during this webinar, and we're also going to give you a little sneak peek for our plans for 2025. I'm Dr. Ash Lovell, and I am joined today by Maddie. I'm going to just get us started. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for People for Bikes, and that means I get to oversee all of our regulatory and legislative work at the federal, state, and local level as it relates to bike business. Over to you, Maddie.
And I'm Maddie. I'm a state and local policy coordinator at People for Bikes, and I work on all things communications, tracking, helping support our team engage on policies, and managing Vote for Bikes.
Thanks, Maddie. So Maddie and I will be the face of all of our policy work for this webinar, but there are many other people who work on this at People for Bikes. I will just shout them out by name. Martina Haggerty, our Vice President of Infrastructure, Matt Moore, our General Counsel, Rachel Fussell, our Recreation and Policy Manager. We are actually hiring for a state and local senior manager, and I hope I didn't forget anyone. Did I forget anyone, Maddie?
Federal.
Oh, and we're hiring for a federal position. Yes. If you are interested in either of those positions, those applications are still open. We are, if you can't tell, gearing up for a really big year in 2025 at all levels of government. There's going to be a lot going on. But before we get ahead of ourselves into next year, let's talk about all the great things that happened in the bike business and infrastructure space in 2024. Okay, so our agenda for today is a quick introduction to People for Bikes. Who are we? What do we do? Who do we represent? All those great things. We'll talk about our 2024 policy wins, and then we'll talk about our 2025 policy priorities, and we'll end with a question and answer session. So if you haven't submitted a question and you have a burning question for us to answer during this webinar, please feel free to drop that into the chat and or follow up with us separately after this call, and we will be happy to answer them. Okay. All right. So who is People for Bikes? People for Bikes is the bicycle industry's trade association, and we are also a large nationwide bicycling advocacy organization. We have a vision to make the US the best place in the world to ride a bike. There's a lot that goes into this vision. There's a lot of things that need to happen in order to make that a reality. And this is really our big driving goal and our big vision for the organization and for the industry. And when I say industry, I mean all of these amazing, beautiful brands. We have over 320 different industry members, manufacturers that make up the trade association for the bicycle industry. You hopefully recognize a few of the brands that are on here. There may be some that you don't recognize. It is a diverse and thriving group of individuals that all work together to help make biking better. Okay, so as I said, we have 325 coalition members. We have 1.4 million supporters. We have over 1,800 bike projects that we're tracking nationally and over 2,500 cities that we're doing city ratings around. If you haven't heard of city ratings, it's an amazing way to figure out what bike infrastructure looks like in your backyard. We can talk a little bit more about that later. And we work in all 50 states. So again, we work at the federal level with Congress and the executive branch, and we work at every state in terms of tracking bike business and infrastructure legislation. And then we engage on a lot of these different bills. I think we had about 500 different pieces of legislation that we tracked last year, and we engaged in probably over half of those. And there will be more next year. So lots of great work at the state level, and then also working at the local level on things like really getting that infrastructure put in on the ground and getting funding for infrastructure allocated appropriately, as well as things like preventing bans for e-bikes and battery safety legislation, and lots of other things that we'll get into. So just a quick overview of who People for Bikes is. So how do we make the US the best place in the world to ride a bike? We have three different pillars that we organize our work around. The first is infrastructure. In order to be a great place for people to ride, you need safe places for them to ride, safe and connected places. That's our infrastructure work. Policy work, obviously there's a lot of policy that goes into putting good infrastructure in on the ground, but we also have policy that relates to bike business. That's really kind of my area of expertise. And then participation. Who's riding? What are they riding? Where are they riding it? What would they like to be riding? This is a really important thing for the bicycle industry to understand, but it's also really important for bicycle advocates to understand. What do people need? What aren't they getting right now? What's working well? Where can we find models from different communities across the country? People we know are participating in really high levels ever since the pandemic. This is great news for everyone involved in bicycling. And how can we get even more people to participate in all the joys that is cycling? Okay. Maddie, you want to talk about our advocacy resources?
Yes, thank you. So People for Bikes offers a multitude of resources to help support advocacy efforts. Our city ratings program measures bike infrastructure networks around the country and outlines progress made, lessons learned, and how to implement policies that accelerate the construction of safe and connected infrastructure that improves city rating scores. Learn more at cityratings.peopleforbikes.org. We also have a repository of data that outlines the benefits of bike infrastructure, participation insights, and much more to help inform your local advocacy efforts. Learn more at infrastructure.peopleforbikes.org. And finally, People for Bikes tracks policies at the federal, state, and local levels and sends out action alerts that makes it easy for you to contact your policymakers and take action on issues that impact you and your community. You can sign up to receive these localized communications as well as submit a request for an action alert by visiting the Tools and Resources page at infrastructure.peopleforbikes.org. Next slide, please. And like Ash mentioned, we're also the trade association for the US bike industry. And so we offer our members a variety of resources to support their businesses, including participation and consumer insights, support relating to trade and tariff, supply chain, sustainability compliance, and a lot of other policy issues, standardized owner's manuals, including our newly launched translated battery operating manual, and opportunities to learn, network, and help shape the future of the bike industry. Learn more in our member center or reach out for more information about how we can assist you. Next slide. So now I will dive into the priorities that we worked on in 2024. Next slide. So the Great Bicycle Infrastructure Project priorities, which includes our infrastructure and policy work, what we tracked and engaged on, were dedicated bike infrastructure funding. This is our #1 priority and really helps to move the needle on getting more safer and connected places built in communities. Mandating complete streets policies and lower speed limits for safer street design. And these complete streets mandates and lower speed limits are really the most effective policies to make streets safer for all people, including those who ride a bike. And then we also advance bike infrastructure through climate legislation and position bikes as a climate solution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled. And then the e-bike access and bike business priorities that we tracked and engaged on to support the bike industry were e-bike incentives, which help get more people riding and more bikes sold, Model 3 class legislation, e-bike safety, right to repair, e-bike battery recycling, lithium-ion battery certifications, as well as trade and tariff, including the generalized system of preferences and the miscellaneous tariff bill. Next slide. And so this is a graphic depiction of some of our top wins. And as you can see, and like Ash mentioned, we work in all 50 states and engaged on over 500 pieces of legislation. And these were some of the big wins. And so next slide. And so infrastructure funding is the #1 priority of the Great Bicycle Infrastructure Project. And I really want to highlight our Vote for Bikes campaign because it was a really big 2024. This campaign tracks and supports pro-bike ballot measures on state and local ballots across the country to invest in better biking and create safer and more connected places to ride. In 2024, like I said, it was a big year. and an historic amount of funding was approved by voters for bike infrastructure projects and programming. And this shows that Americans do value opportunities to get outside and recreate or travel around their community to everyday destinations safely, regardless of their mode of transportation. And this year, People for Bikes tracked 38 measures, 33 of which were approved by voters, and these total $27.4 billion in funding over the next 30 years. Roughly 60% of this funding will go towards on-road infrastructure improvements like protected bike lanes, road safety improvements, traffic calming upgrades, and bike network expansions. The remaining 40% of this funding will go towards off-road infrastructure projects like the acquisition of open space to expand recreation opportunities and the construction and maintenance of trails. A couple notable wins include the Minnesota Natural Resources and Environment Trust Fund Amendment that reauthorizes $1 billion in state lottery revenue for conservation and recreation projects, California Proposition 4, a $10 billion climate bond, a first ever bond appropriation for the Main Trails program, the Central Ohio Transit Authority sales and use tax that will build 500 miles of new bike and multi-use trails around Columbus, Ohio, Seattle Proposition 1, a $1.5 billion transportation levy, and protecting $1.3 billion in funding for bike projects and programs by rejecting Initiative 2117 in Washington State. Next slide. Another great bicycle infrastructure project priority is mandating complete streets policies that require the planning, scoping, and maintenance of roads to address the safety and accessibility needs of all road users. In March, voters in the car-centric city of Los Angeles approved Measure HLA with 2/3 of the vote in support of road safety improvements for all road users. This requires that any resurfacing projects over 1/8 of a mile must include Mobility Plan 2035 updates, such as protected bike lanes. And this will ensure that the streets in Los Angeles are more friendly for people who ride, walk, roll, or take transit. California SB 960 was signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom in September and increases accountability on complete streets projects by requiring the State Department of Transportation, Caltrans, to include active transportation improvements in state highway operation and protection program projects so that people biking, walking, and taking transit have safe places to move around their communities, as many state roadways double as local streets. And finally, Minnesota HF 5247 requires that the Commissioner of the Department of Transportation must implement a complete streets policy in consultation with local governments, regional agencies, and other stakeholders. Previous language in Minnesota made complete streets implementation much more discretionary. Next slide. And our last infrastructure win that I will discuss is lowering speed limits and prioritizing safer street designs, which, like I said, are the most effective ways to reduce serious injuries and save the lives of road users. And so I briefly discussed Minnesota HF 5247 on the previous slide. And so in addition to mandating complete streets, it also goes further than any other state-level bicycle policy by recognizing that motorists bear responsibility for keeping vulnerable road users, such as cyclists, safe from collisions from their much larger, more dangerous vehicles. It also updates driver education standards to include information about driving amongst vulnerable road users, the rights and responsibilities of vulnerable road users, and best practices to minimize dangers and avoid collisions, as well as the duties of a driver when encountering vulnerable road users on the road. Utah HB 449 amended the current Pedestrian Safety and Facilities Act to include bicyclists and requires municipalities and the Utah Department of Transportation to consider bicyclist safety through a more active approach to road design that encompasses the needs of all vulnerable road users. Michigan HB 4012 allows local control of speed limits, which is critical because communities now have the power to lower and set speed limits more in line with their local context, which can be life-saving if urban, suburban, and rural communities don't have to apply a one-size-fits-all approach. Similarly, after a years-long effort and lots of hard work from advocates, Sammy's Law was signed into law in May as part of the New York state budget. This law allows communities to set speed limits that are appropriate for their local context, specifically allowing New York City to lower the speed limit to 20 miles per hour in order to save lives in a densely populated area with lots of traffic. And now I'll pass it back to Ash for e-bike and bike business policy wins.
Thanks, Maddie. Amazing work. And folks, I just want to highlight that this is really just a highlight of some of the legislation that we've worked on this year. If you want a real deep dive on a lot of the different things that we worked on in 2024, we're happy to send you some really extensive memos that we often send to our industry members, about 20 something pages of all of the different legislation and regulatory work that we're doing. So feel free to follow up with us separately, and we're happy to dive in deeper on any of these topics if you'd like to discuss more. Okay, so Maddie just did a wonderful job talking about all of our infrastructure wins, some of our infrastructure wins that we did this year. I will talk about some bike business wins that we had at the state and local level. So you may have heard about lithium-ion battery safety. If you haven't, welcome to the wonderful world of battery safety. It is really important for batteries and electrical systems to be certified to appropriate standards in order to keep folks safe in places from New York City to California, all across the country. So we had a couple of really big wins this year in the lithium-ion battery and electrical system space. New York S154F is really the model piece of legislation that includes both the UL 2849 system standard and the EN 15194 system standard. UL is the American Battery Safety and System Standard. EN is the European. It's important to have both of these pieces because there's a lot of high quality manufacturers that also supply their products to Europe that have been certifying under the EN standard for a really long time. And we want to make sure that both the products that they're producing now and the products that they've produced in the past can have replacement batteries, can be serviced, can be sold into the market. So we had big wins both in New York and in California. SB 1271 included the same language that is included in New York. One of our big goals as the trade association and a nationwide cycling nonprofit is to create model legislation for folks who are interested in tackling these issues in their states or in their communities to say, oh, we already have a model. And we know that New York has been dealing with this battery safety issue for a few years. They probably got it right. Let's just use that model instead of creating something entirely new. So this is our model lithium-ion battery and electrical system legislation. We know there are at least 5 or 6 states that are looking at implementing this same legislation next year. And our big goal as the trade association, as well as promoting safety and safe places for people to ride and safe charging and the purchase of safe and reliable products, is also to create harmonized standards across states and municipalities so that our manufacturers can continue to sell their products in multiple different markets across the country. Okay, e-bike definitions. This is an important piece of the ongoing legislative and regulatory conversations around electric bicycles. We created the Model 3 class legislation about 10 years ago, and now I'll talk about that in a minute, but there's about 43 states that have this model legislation on their books defining what an e-bike is, and that if this product fits within this definition, it should be treated as a bicycle instead of a motorized vehicle. We know that there are some products that are maybe blurring some lines around what an e-bike is and what it's not. They may go faster than 20 miles an hour with the throttle. They may be calling themselves an electric bicycle when really they're more like an e-moped. So we have new model legislation that really more clearly defines that 3-class system, both in Utah, HB 85, and in Minnesota, HF 5247. So these, again, are harmonized, these 2 pieces of model legislation. So we have 2 states that say the same thing about this is what you call an out-of-class electric vehicle. If it doesn't fit the definition of an electric bicycle, either the federal definition coming from 16 CFR 1512 in the Federal Register, or within the 3-class system that should be on the books in your state, then it's not an electric bicycle. This is a really important piece of legislation, both for recreational riding, understanding what should and shouldn't be on trails, and for transportation riding, understanding how fast people should go, what kind of products should be on sidewalks, on roads, on multi-use trails, all of that. So again, as the technology advances, our legislation and our regulations need to advance to align with it. Okay, I talked about Model 3 class legislation. We have 2 new states that came on this year, Oregon and Rhode Island, that now align fully with the Model 3 class legislation. That means there's only 1 state left in the country that doesn't classify an electric bicycle as a bicycle and instead classifies it as a motorized vehicle. And that happens to be one of our larger states, that is Alaska. So we will be looking at you next year, Alaska. This is really important, again, for that harmonization piece. So folks know what is and is not an electric bicycle, and those definitions aren't different from one state to another. So you can see in this map, we have a lot of states that align perfectly with the Model 3 class legislation. We have a couple that are slightly different, but we've made a ton of progress on this initiative over the last 10 years. And this is really important for consumers to understand what is and is not an electric bicycle, for law enforcement to understand how to enforce what people are riding, for legislators to understand, oh yeah, this is not a motorized vehicle, this is a bicycle and should be treated as such, and for regulators to say, ah, that product is going too fast, or that product is overpowered. That is not an electric bicycle according to our 3-class legislation. Okay, so that's kind of the less flashy parts of our bike business work at the state and local level, those definitions. What is flashy is our e-bike incentives. This is another project that's been going on for quite a while with People4Bikes. This year, we saw multiple new e-bike incentive programs launched. Michigan approved $2.95 million toward their e-bike incentive. They're still working on the implementation of this new e-bike incentive, but that money has been approved, and we are very hopeful for that in 2025. Bentonville allocated over $2 million toward a new e-bike incentive in their town. Atlanta, Georgia advocated over $1 million. Washington, D.C. allocated over 500,000. And Portland, Oregon allocated $20 million for their e-mobility e-bike incentive program, which was approved in 2023, but is rolling out this year and into 2025. There's also a lot of other e-bike incentives that are active right now. If you want to see if you have an incentive in your backyard, there's a great tracker run by Trek, T-R-E-C, and we can send you the link to that in the follow-up from this. Really great work here. This is great for people in terms of being able to afford a high quality product at a lower price. This is great for cities in terms of decongesting their urban areas because more folks are riding than driving. This is great for our air quality. Again, less folks driving, more folks riding. We really see this state and local level emphasis on creating these e-bike incentives as a major priority for this year and going into 2025. Okay, on the recreation side, we also have a lot of access wins at the state and local level this year. In California, there was a finding of no significant impact for the Pines to Mines Trail. This is a really big deal because, again, we have these models that say, oh, if there's a class 1 electric mountain bike on a trail, it doesn't have a significantly larger impact than a regular mountain bike does on a trail. So it's easy for folks who are leading these land management agencies making these decisions to say, okay, now we have a model, we have a case study. This is important for us to make our own decisions. In Michigan, there was legislation that allows class 1 electric bicycles on natural surface, non-motorized trails in all state parks. So a really big win there. Lots more access opened up in Michigan. In Minnesota, they allocated $11 million for the expansion of trails in their state. The work that we do is not just EMTB related, it's all recreation focused. Another big important piece for recreation and access is landowner liability. This is a issue in Colorado that was just resolved with a piece of model legislation. So if you'd like to learn more about that, This is essentially keeping access areas open and ensuring that liability is appropriately allocated. And that comes to the end of our 2024 big policy wins. Again, this is just a highlight. We could have been talking to you for 3 hours about all the different bills that we worked on and fought for and fought against in 2024. But we didn't want to spend all of that time. Instead, we want to make sure that we're giving you a good high-level overview. We leave you wanting more. If you have more questions, again, please follow up with us. I'm going to hand it back to Maddie, and she's going to talk about our 2025 agenda.
Yes, so here's a sneak peek of what we will work on in 2025. And so these are largely the same priorities because we have found that these policies are what significantly move the needle on safe and connected places to ride that get more people riding more often and help support the bike industry. And so infrastructure, advocating for funds to build on-road and off-road infrastructure, which includes supporting e-bike incentives as well as bike share programs. E-bike definitions and access, defining what is an e-bike as well as what is not an e-bike through our out-of-class electric vehicle legislation, battery standards, raising these standards for e-bike electrical systems and lithium-ion batteries, which has been in the news a lot. And so we are actively working on this area. Recreational access, like Ash just discussed, there's a lot of positive momentum. And so we're going to work to continue this and continue expanding access for bicycles on trail, including Class 1 EMTBs wherever traditional bikes are allowed, passing complete streets mandates, that help facilitate safer road design as well as safe speeds, and allowing local control of speed limits to lower speed limits to 20 miles per hour to really make streets safer for people who ride. And centering bikes and climate legislation to reduce vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of legislation in this area that will be introduced in 2025, so we're very excited for that. And because we are the industry trade association, we are also focusing on bills regarding the environmental and social responsibility of our products, as well as compliance for the industry. And we engage on these policies by tracking them from the time that they are introduced to hopefully the time that they are signed, sending in letters of support for pro-bike legislation or letters of opposition for harmful legislation, testifying on behalf of the coalition, producing localized and federal action alerts, and collaborating with local partners on the ground. And for bills that were passed during previous sessions, we also continue to support the implementation of these bills to ensure their impact. And, as with a lot of the e-bike work, there's always defensive work or work that we don't know about. And so we remain nimble to react to these new issues as they arise. Next slide. And so if you work for an advocacy organization, are a member of the bike industry who wants to get more involved, are a policymaker considering any type of bike-related legislation, or simply want to make your community more rideable, please reach out. We would love to work with you and help support safe and connected places to ride across the country. Next slide. So thank you for attending this webinar, listening to all of our 2024 wins, getting a head start on our 2025 priorities. Here are our emails if you have any questions. So like I said, please reach out. We want to hear from you. Ash, if you have any other closing thoughts.
Thank you all very much for being here for this very intensive overview of all of the things that People for Bikes worked on in the legislative space in 2024 and our preview of 2025. We do have time for some questions if folks want to drop them into the chat.
Yes, so there are some questions already in the chat. We'll give you a second if you have any to write them. But first, now that California has language defining what is an e-bike as well as what is not an e-bike, do you think other states will follow?
That's a great question. I'll take this one. Yes, we hope other states will follow. We know that there's been problems with enforcement, with safety concerns, with conversations about banning electric bicycles in totality. And what we really want here is for this legislation that's in Utah and Minnesota, and California has language as well, to really help folks understand better, what are you buying? Are you buying an e-bike? Are you not buying an e-bike? where can these products be ridden? If they say that they are an off-road product, they should not be ridden on sidewalks or on roads. And then also just helping law enforcement better understand, like, okay, how do we solve this problem of concerns about community safety? What's the best way to do enforcement? What's the best way to integrate education? What's the best way to work with parents and children if it's a concern in your community? So yeah, we're taking kind of a stepwise approach to addressing safety concerns about these out-of-class electric vehicles. And we do think that the legislation in California, Minnesota, and Utah will help us just keep moving that needle forward.
Great. And then another question from what UL Solutions says about the EN battery safety standard. It's not as thorough as UL standards. So why include EN?
Great question. So Mr. Matt Moore and I have been working on this for the last 3-ish years. And the real reason for including both the EN and the UL standards is that there are a lot of really high quality products that are certified to the EN standard that are just as safe as the UL 2849 certified products that have been sold into the US. And that's system certification is actually older than the UL 2849 standard certification. To our knowledge, no products that either meet the EN standard or the UL standard have been the cause of the real battery fire concerns in New York City in particular. And we really think it's important for high quality products to be able to not only be sold into the market, but also to be able to be serviced and to have their replacement batteries included. So this is really a long-term play. I think we know that a lot of our industry is working toward UL 2849. When we initially talked to the Consumer Product Safety Commission a few years ago, we asked for a runway for UL 2849 compliance. It's been a few years. We know the majority of our industry members are already certifying to that system standard. And we want to make sure that those high quality products that are in the market now can continue to have those replacement batteries. And the last thing that I'll say is that there's just a lot of misunderstanding about the types of products that have been causing the battery fires. Those products generally weren't certified to any system standard. So we know New York City has done a great job of enforcement and education around battery certifications and battery charging safety. We've seen the number of fires drop dramatically. And this is a multi-component kind of initiative. Not only do we need certifications and high quality standards and education for consumers on what they're buying and how to charge responsibly, but we also really need to close that de minimis loophole that allows products that are under $800 to not have to meet any of the safety certifications as they come into the country. So that's a big thing that we're working on at the federal level.
Yeah, you actually just answered one of our other questions about how do we keep these out-of-class electric vehicles who don't fit into the 3-class definition out of the US. So yes, working on de minimis is one of our federal priorities, but really great answers, Ash. Thank you for answering those.
Thanks, Maddie.
And it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So here's some great questions. Do you have any educational resources for parents, especially since it's gift giving time, to educate them on the different classes of e-bikes versus motorbikes?
Fabulous question. Yes, we do. We have a rider education campaign called eBike Smart. You can go to ebikesmart.org. It's got all the information you should need about what to buy, what maybe not to buy for your kids, how to ride responsibly, how to start riding an e-bike, how to charge, all of that. ebikesmart.org. It's a free online resource for folks. We actually also just had a great little piece come out from Matt Moore. It's called, oh man, I remember the initial title, but it's, we will send it as a follow-up. It's about what kind of e-bike to buy your kid this holiday season. So let me follow up with that. I don't want to get the title wrong. Good question.
Yeah, and along those lines, do you have any tips for people who are anti-e-bike? Do you have any thoughts about how cities can contract with providers such as spin instead of a service?
Mm, good question. I think this question relates to folks that like don't want e-bikes in their cities operating at all. I'm not entirely sure about the context for this question. Feel free to follow up with me via email. Again, ash@peopleforbikes.org. But to answer the question I think you're asking, there's a lot to be said about electric bicycles for transportation and e-mobility for transportation in terms of getting more people riding, the health implications, the climate implications, the decongestion implications, and how to do it well so that safety concerns do not rise to the top. As with any new technology, there's always some time of adjustment. And we know that there are a lot of cities, especially those on our East and West Coast, that have had electric bicycles in operation, whether it's with bike share systems or delivery workers, or just a lot of folks taking their kids to school in the back of their e-bike like I do. These bikes have been around for a while, so there's a lot of great models for how to introduce them in a commuting sense, in a shared micromobility sense, or in a delivery sense that make sense for folks. So yeah, let's follow up separately because I want to make sure I answer your question well.
Great. And I just put the resource that Ash mentioned in our previous question. Should you buy your kid an e-bike? I just put that link in the chat. And there's another question about any e-bike insurance requirements for consumers on the radar.
Great question. Matt Moore and I worked closely on some potential legislation in New Jersey in 2024 that would have required registration and insurance. And in our work on that piece of legislation, we discovered that there's not really any insurance available, even if it was to be mandated. There's no existing product that would fit the needs of e-bike insurance. So that is a looming issue. It's something PeopleForBikes will definitely be working on in 2025. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what your homeowner's insurance covers, if your e-bike is stolen, and about like what would actually help keep people safe on roads. The New Jersey legislation was designed to keep people riding more safely, but really the majority of accidents or collisions that happen with e-mobility products, e-bikes, are between an automobile and an e-bike or e-mobility product. And those insurance questions get a little muddy there. So it's definitely on the radar. It will probably be an emerging issue, but at the moment, I don't know of any other legislation outside of New Jersey that's talking about this. Maddie, I think you're on mute.
Great, thank you. I would think by now I would have figured out Zoom. Yeah, I don't see any other questions, so last call. All right, I think that's it. Thank you so much for answering all those questions, Ash, and thank you all for joining us to listen all about our work in 2024 and what we plan to tackle in 2025. We really appreciate all of you supporting PeopleForBikes and helping support the industry and safer places to ride across the country.
Thanks all.